And so the strangling remark, while shocking when first uttered, was just a pale portent of what was to come, a slap compared to the thunderbolt hurled at Goldhagen from on high by the next speaker. The way the symposium was structured, Goldhagen spoke first, following which he returned to his seat and attempted to maintain his composure, with relative success, as the blows began to fall from other panelists. Beginning with the charge of worthlessness, an epithet all the more shocking to the packed auditorium because of its source. One of the demigods in the pantheon of Holocaust scholarship, Raoul Hilberg. One who did not appear in person to pronounce Goldhagen's book worthless, but who relayed his angry condemnation through a panelist who proclaimed it by waving aloft a letter from Hilberg, brandishing the interdiction in "I have a list" fashion. The flamboyant, red-faced, angry bearer of the bad tidings for Goldhagen was an Austrian Holocaust scholar, resident fellow at the Holocaust Memorial Museum, Konrad Quite. Quite, of course, did not neglect to make his own heated attack on Goldhagen, an attack that could be summed up by the well-known barb, "What's true isn't new, and what's new isn't true." First of all, Quite argued, the effort to find the deep root, the explanation of Hitler and the Holocaust in some intrinsic pathology of German culture was something German intellectuals themselves had been seeking for decades since the war. One version of what might be called German exceptionalism was the notion of the Sonderweg, the special path German history and culture had taken in the centuries since the Reformation. In its more pointed, more self-lacerating form, this became the post-war Schuldfrage controversy, the blame question, in which some German thinkers contended there was something not merely exceptional, but deeply, darkly wrong in German culture, that the violent extremism of thought to be found in Nietzsche and Wagner made Hitler possible, if not inevitable. Goldhagen seems to go further, as if to say that Hitler was virtually irrelevant to a Germany pregnant with murder. Any midwife would do. But Quite goes further, too, in accusing Goldhagen not merely of ignoring previous explorations of the Germanness of the Nazi genocide, but of resurrecting naive and discredited notions of German national character and packaging it as a revolutionary new thesis. It was the packaging, Quite declared, that was the most offensive aspect of the Goldhagen thesis. "Only those who offer extreme views can make a name for themselves," he said. It was at this point Quite pulled out the missive from Raoul Hilberg and told the crowd, "I have a letter here," from the Vermont-dwelling sage, a letter in which Hilberg says, "I take exception to Goldhagen's thesis, which is worthless, all the hype from his publisher Knopf notwithstanding." Worthless is fairly strong, virtually a scholarly anathema. It's true that, in his book, Goldhagen did take more than exception to an essential component of Hilberg's life work, his 3-volume history of the Holocaust, the destruction of the European Jews, virtually declaring it worthless, or at least founded on worthless misconceptions of the evidence. So it could be said that Hilberg's anathema was not without a personal agenda. But the battle between them is a crucial one. The issue transcends the ad hominem element, and it's worth taking a look at the source of their division. The attempt to explain both the alacrity and efficiency with which the German perpetrators accomplished the task of mass murder. It is similar to the question of excessive virulence that is at the heart of the explanatory perplexity over Hitler. Why was this anti-Semite different from all other anti-Semites? Goldhagen poses this question about the German perpetrators of the Holocaust, not the paper-shuffling middlemen, but the actual executioners of the genocide. What made them not just cold-blooded killers, but ones who reveled in cruelty, torture, and the degradation of their victims? Goldhagen dismisses what he calls the 5 conventional explanations for this phenomenon, that they were coerced on pain of execution to participate, that they were blindly following orders because they were unwavering servants of authority, that peer pressure and conformity made them do it, that they were like petty bureaucrats pursuing careerist self-interest, and finally, that they were not aware that their individual actions were part of a monstrous design for mass murder. All these conventional explanations are wrong, Goldhagen says, because they assume that German citizens would otherwise be opposed to the mass killing of Jews, that they had to be numbed, coerced, or made unaware of the magnitude of the crimes they were participating in. No, he says, it's false to believe that Germans needed special inducements of institutionalized self-deception or peer pressure to join in the killing. As Milton Himmelfarb says of Hitler, Goldhagen says of ordinary Germans, they wanted to. And then Goldhagen holds up Raoul Hilberg as an exemplar of this sort of false conventional thinking, because Hilberg asks, just how did the German bureaucracy overcome its moral scruples? Hilberg assumes that the German bureaucracy naturally had moral scruples regarding the treatment of Jews, which with difficulty had to be surmounted. Explanations proceeding in this manner, Goldhagen insists, cannot account for Germans taking initiative, doing more than they had to, or volunteering for killing duty when no such volunteering was necessary. Such explanations cannot account for the instances in which Germans killed Jews in violation of orders not to do so. They cannot account for the overall, indeed incredible smoothness that characterized the execution of this far-flung program, which was dependent upon so many people who, either through sabotage or foot-dragging, could have produced innumerable mishaps and poorly executed tasks. In other words, Goldhagen was saying that Hilberg's explanatory work of a lifetime was not merely worthless, it was trying to answer the wrong question entirely, trying to find reasons why Germans were transformed into killers by Hitler and his party, when Goldhagen believed they needed little transformation at all. But I think something more was going on beneath the surface charges of worthlessness traded by Goldhagen and Hilberg. I think the submerged issue can be found in the word smoothness, the incredible smoothness of the execution process and how to account for it. Hilberg's massive account of the vast, continent-wide, German-organized mobilization of troops, trains, guards, and resources that went into engineering the Holocaust has been criticized because Hilberg described a Jewish contribution to this smoothness. He argued that the cooperation, even complicity, of the Judenräte, the so-called Jewish councils in the ghettos, in rounding up and making available Jews for transshipment to death camps, made the work of the German killers easier. Hilberg's argument on that point could be a bit unfairly caricatured by saying he saw reluctant executioners and willing victims. As the son of a Holocaust survivor, Goldhagen's animus against Hilberg might be attributed to a desire to restore the onus for the smoothness of the mass murder to the eager alacrity of the perpetrators, to blame the smoothness on Germans rather than Jews. But if this submerged battle was the hidden agenda beneath Hilberg's worthless charge, it didn't diminish the impact of the critic's accusation, particularly on the audience most of whom had come to salute Goldhagen, seek his autograph. There were stirrings of indignation and unease. And then things got worse. The following speaker, an even more lofty member of the Holocaust scholar pantheon than Hilberg, launched an attack that was even more harsh and sweeping. The following speaker was none other than Yehuda Bauer, widely regarded as perhaps the most scrupulous and clear-sighted historian of the Holocaust in the world. He'd been spending the year as a fellow of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Still wiry, vigorous, and energetic at 70, Bauer leaped up and seized the microphone, radiating intensity and passion as he paced the stage. It came as a surprise to me, since the Bauer I'd seen in Jerusalem had been so deliberate and reserved. But tonight he was like a man possessed, a man with a mission. After offering some dutiful praise for the less controversial aspects of Goldhagen's work, the chapters on the work battalions and the death marches, Bauer moved swiftly to the attack, beginning with the packaging of Goldhagen's thesis, particularly in its claim to newness, the notion that no one had previously dared point the finger at the true source of genocide, which he, Goldhagen alone, was bold enough to name: 19th century German eliminationist anti-Semitism. Bauer expressed astonishment that Goldhagen had made his assertions about the special genocidal virulence of German anti-Semitism without placing it in the context of other national versions of anti-Semitism in Europe at that time. "What about Russia, Romania, Poland?" he asked. "What about France?" And he went on to substantiate George Steiner's contention to me that French anti-Semitism was far worse, far more virulent, deep-rooted, and bitter than Germany's in the pre-World War I period. Bauer cited the highly regarded historian George Mosse, who had done comparative studies and had said that if someone had come to me in 1914 and told me that one country in Europe would attempt to exterminate the Jews, I would have said then, "No one can be surprised at the depths to which the French could sink." Bauer's point was that if there was something intrinsically German about the Holocaust, it is inherent not in the rhetoric or ideology of 19th century German writing, which could be matched in violence and virulence by the products of other European nations. But rather, Bauer suggested, if there's an intrinsic Germanness to the killing, it might better be sought for in the susceptibility of Germans to the extreme authoritarian character of the Nazi Party, of the Hitler state. But Bauer didn't stop there. Pacing the stage of the Meyerhof Auditorium, with Goldhagen sitting at a table behind him, Bauer went beyond denouncing the thesis to denouncing the person behind it. Not Goldhagen. He didn't even accord Goldhagen adult responsibility for it. "It's not Goldhagen's fault," he told the audience. "It's his Harvard tutor's fault." It was the Harvard tutorial system that failed Goldhagen, he said, since his book grew out of a Harvard Ph.D. thesis. "It's the tutor's fault. You don't permit a study like this without comparatives, with a complete disregard for German history, which ignores the opposition. No social democrats, no communists. You can read Goldhagen, and it seems like Hitler gained power by vote. In the last free election, the Nazis had 33% of the vote. 67% did not vote Nazi. They came to power because they lost votes in that last election, because they no longer seemed dangerous to the conservative camarilla around the senile President Hindenburg." Having reduced Goldhagen to a wayward student failed by his tutors, Bauer returned to the attack, this time chastising Goldhagen personally, without the pretense of blaming it on his tutor. Bauer spoke of the need for humility in the face of the Holocaust, and added, "When you open your book by saying, 'I am the first, I am the only, all others are wrong,' when you start off with media hype, you run the risk of ending up like Arno Mayer," the Princeton professor whose book argued that the Holocaust was less about hatred of Jews than of Bolsheviks. "It's gone," Bauer said of Mayer's book, after its initial media hype. "And rightly so. It was the wrong way to start. You have to have humility. You don't start with PR." After this intellectual equivalent of a horsewhipping, Professor Langer returned to the microphone to offer Goldhagen the cold comfort that what he'd received from Yehuda Bauer was not a death sentence, but a life sentence, for which he should presumably feel grateful and relieved. Again, the imagery of violence and retribution, an execution, mercifully suspended. Goldhagen was given the grim scholarly equivalent of life imprisonment. The worst was over. Yes, there were further attacks on Goldhagen's thesis. Christopher Browning, Goldhagen's archival and frequent target, had a chance to confront him face to face. But Browning's remarks focused on the issue between them, not on Goldhagen's motives, the packaging of his book, or the hype surrounding it. It was almost as if the succeeding speakers had been shaken by the thunderbolt from Hilberg, the lightning strike from Bauer. By the time of my meeting with Goldhagen several weeks later, what had begun as, if not a tempest in a teapot, then an academic furor, had escalated even further, had begun to take on the dimensions of a transnational firestorm. The book had provoked headlines in Germany as newspapers and magazines seized on Goldhagen's book as an assault on the German national character. Ein Volk von Dämonen? A people of the devil? Asked the lurid headline of the cover story in Der Spiegel. It was the exact same epithet Hitler used to characterize the Jews, implying that Goldhagen was using the same rhetoric of collective intrinsic evil. Meanwhile, Die Zeit, a leading German weekly, was serializing the critical attacks on Goldhagen made by Jewish scholars at the Holocaust Memorial Museum and calling the controversy another Historikerstreit, another battle over the German past, the German identity, the German special path as momentous as the one that convulsed German intellectuals in the 80s. But this was deeper and more divisive. It wasn't German versus German. It was American versus German, Jew versus German, although at the Holocaust Memorial Museum it had been mostly Jew versus Jew. The American-German aspect of it, the German press implied, could result in a freeze, if not a breach, in relations between the two countries, Goldhagen's book thus becoming more than a thesis about history, but a fact of it. In fact, American reverberations from the controversy in Germany disrupted my first scheduled meeting with Goldhagen. I had arranged with his publicist at Knopf to coordinate an interview session with his visit to New York to address German scholars and writers at New York University's Goethe House about a month after the Holocaust Memorial Museum brawl. But at the last minute, Goldhagen abruptly canceled the NYU meeting and his New York trip. He'd learned that a substantial number of representatives of the German media would be present at Goethe House, and he issued a statement saying he didn't want to engage in further running discourse with the German press until his book was available in German translation for the German people to read and judge for themselves. The position had its merits, but tactically it might have given some the impression that he was avoiding critical scrutiny. By the time Goldhagen did appear in New York, the following week, he looked somewhat shaken by the sudden international dimension of the controversy, although I didn't realize how shaken until about a half hour into our talk, which took place in the cavernous main lounge of the Yale Club. I also wasn't aware at first of the source of his distress. It had seemed to me that the hostile German response should have been more predictable and less disturbing to him than the attack by Jewish scholars. But as it turned out, it was not so much the general German uproar that was upsetting to him that day, as one specific manifestation of it. One German writer's intrusive psychological explanation of his thesis, an attempt to explain his explanation, to explain him, that had unsettled him. But I didn't become aware of all that until he broke off the interview. Our conversation began productively enough. I was curious to hear more from Goldhagen about a figure almost absent from his book, Adolf Hitler. In Goldhagen's focus on Germans and Germanism, Hitler seemed to vanish from view. I wondered whether Hitler's Austrian origin had something to do with it, whether it posed a problem to Goldhagen's ascription of the genocidal impulse to a specifically German source. Many scholars have argued that, in fact, Austrian anti-Semitism was something different from the German variety, that it was, in many ways, even more virulent. One estimate has it that Austrians made up a full 40% of SS officers assigned to death camp command duty, and 8 out of 12 concentration camps were headed by Austrians. And, of course, the man in charge of administering the entire extermination process was the other Austrian Adolf, Eichmann. Sir Isaiah Berlin has written about the borderland effect, in which those on the periphery of empires, as the Austrian Germans were on the periphery of the German Reich, often manifested more feverishly radical xenophobic hatreds than those securely within its borders. And Norman Cohn, the director of the International Research Project on Genocide at the University of Sussex, and author of a study of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, has written of the way the Völkisch racist outlook was perhaps even stronger in Austria, on the periphery of the German-speaking world, where, ever since the War of 1866, the German-speaking element had felt isolated and threatened by the preponderant Slav element of the Habsburg Kingdom. Indeed, Cohn defines Hitler's Austrianness against his Germanness. He embodied a whole century of Austrian frustration, disappointment, and insecurity, and the boundless lust for revenge which possessed him was a magnified version of something which possessed a whole stratum of Austrian society. I asked Goldhagen if he regarded Hitler's Austrianness as something that distinguished him from the mentality of ordinary Germans, or if he saw it as all of a piece. There were regional variations in anti-Semitism even within Germany, he said, but Hitler's exemplified and brought to an apotheosis the particular form of eliminationist anti-Semitism that came to the fore in the latter part of the 19th century. Whatever the variations, I think Austrian and German anti-Semitism can be seen of a piece, where there was a central model of Jews and a view that they needed to be eliminated. When he speaks of Hitler, it's this central model Goldhagen returns to again and again, a model that, he believes, saturates German culture and Austrian culture, a model that explains Hitler more than any personal trauma or deformation of his personality. The central model takes on the aspect of a malign, personal, prompting evil, an irresistible compulsion whose irresistibility in a way exempts the will it usurps, in effect exculpating the individual it acts upon, making an analysis of individual psyches of Germans, of Hitler himself, irrelevant. I'm not persuaded by the arguments of the psychohistorians, Goldhagen told me. You understand Hitler better by seeing him as bred in a particular culture where these kinds of notions about Jews were quite common. That tells us why he became an anti-Semite better than looking at aspects of his personal biography. Now, if you want to understand how he became as murderous as he did, and why he took these ideas to their, in some sense, logical and most fatal conclusions, then of course we need to plumb the depths of psychology, and that is not my forte. I thought there were two important and possibly contradictory points in Goldhagen's last remark. What you're saying, then, is that psychohistorians are forever searching for some disorder, some trauma or abnormality as the source of Hitler's anti-Semitism, when in fact to be an anti-Semite didn't require a departure from the norm, it was the norm. And to be willing to persecute Jews and to kill them systematically was the norm. I think that Hitler's decision to kill the Jews is derived logically from his belief structure, he said. But he also seems to be saying that there was something about Hitler that exceeded the norm, that exceeds logic, that exceeds Goldhagen's own capacity to plumb the depths of psychology for an explanation of that excess. Clearly there was something more than that, the logic of his ideology, driving Hitler on, Goldhagen added, because it was not just the Jews. There were many other people he killed. He was a man who leaped to murder to solve social problems biologically, by extirpating them. Of course, this is in accord with his view of the world, his racism, his social Darwinism, the general biologism with which he viewed the world. And so I agree with your point that it doesn't require a psychological malformation, but this doesn't, of course, rule out the possibility that, in Hitler's case, there was something else driving him. Something more, something else. He does seem to be conceding here that something more than the ordinary German character, something more than the central model is required to explain Hitler, to explain why Hitler went beyond the relatively passive midwife role. Something to explain what made Hitler, to adapt a Shakespearean birth metaphor, rip murder untimely from the womb. I asked Goldhagen about his pregnant with murder metaphor in relation to Hitler. It invites a characterization of Hitler as mere midwife, doesn't it? The analogy's imperfect, he concedes. It implies the baby comes without the need for the midwife. But no Hitler, no Holocaust, he says, repeating Milton Himmelfarb's phrase, the rhetorical gauntlet Himmelfarb threw down before those who'd see the Holocaust as the inevitable product of abstract historical forces and ideologies, rather than of Hitler's individual will. Goldhagen has an uneasy relationship to Himmelfarb's formula. He wants to embrace it, but even as he expressed agreement, he seems inexorably to undermine it. So you would agree with Himmelfarb's argument? I asked him. No Hitler? Or if not Hitler, someone like Hitler, he said. If the Nazis had never taken power, there would not have been a Hitler. Had there not been a depression in Germany, then in all likelihood the Nazis wouldn't have come to power. The anti-Semitism would have remained a potential in the sense of its killing form. It required a state. Hatreds do not issue in systematic violence unless they are organized by governments. At most, they will produce ethnic violence, pogroms. Hitler was a very powerful leader, and he certainly deepened and widened the existing current of anti-Semitism in Germany, further legitimizing that, and brought people with him. In other words, it was Hitler, but then again it could have been someone else, someone like Hitler. It was not Hitler so much as the party, not the party so much as the state, and the party took over the state because of the economy. It's a revision of No Hitler, No Holocausts that is more like No Hitler, maybe someone else. Goldhagen confirmed my feeling when he proceeded to attempt to recast Max Weber's famous concept of charismatic leadership, the relationship between great men and those who follow them, in this light. Charisma, as we know, Goldhagen began, although it's not often treated this way, but as Max Weber first expressed it, it is not a property of leaders, it's a property of the people, really. The extent to which the leader is charismatic, as Weber discussed it, depends on the belief of the people in his infallibility and the prophet-like nature of the leader. They grant him his charismatic quality. Shortly after my talk with Goldhagen, I reread Weber's famous essay, The Nature of Charismatic Domination, and saw the extent to which Goldhagen had recast Weber to shift the burden of responsibility for the phenomenon of mass hysteria from leaders to followers, that is, from Hitler to ordinary Germans. Yes, the belief, the credulity of his followers is necessary to certify, to recognize the special chosenness of a charismatic leader, Weber says. But his right to rule, Weber states explicitly, is not dependent on their will, as is that of an elected leader. On the contrary, it is the duty of those to whom he is sent to recognize his charismatic qualification. Emphasis added. There is an ambiguity, or more precisely, a dynamic, in Weber's account of charisma. The best analogy is the relationship between hypnotist and subject. The subject's credulity, his willingness to submit to the mesmerist, is essential, but it is the subject who is being mesmerized and manipulated to the hypnotist's will, not the other way around. It is the hypnotist's commands that are obeyed, not the subject's. Goldhagen is here skewing what Weber said to make it better reflect his view that it was the will of the German people, enthralled to the central model of eliminationist anti-Semitism, the will of all the little Hitlers who created the big Hitler to serve their genocidal appetite. They were the ventriloquists, he was their dummy. Of course, it is not an either-or matter, not either Hitler or the German people. It is a matter of where one places the emphasis in the relationship between the two. Goldhagen pressed his point about ordinary Germans being in the driver's seat, rather than Hitler, when it came to choosing the targets of mass murder, by citing the difference between the German people's reaction to the Nazi euthanasia campaign and to the extermination of the Jews. Hitler certainly was a charismatic figure, in the sense that people had a great deal of faith and belief in his extraordinary qualities and were willing to follow him, but not on all matters. When the euthanasia program, the extermination of mental and physical defectives, regardless of religion, a program that may have resulted in 100,000 deaths in 1939 and 1940, became known to the German public, there were protests from churchmen, protests from ordinary Germans, and the program was halted. There were no such protests when news of the extermination of Jews began to spread. From this distinction, Goldhagen argues that it was the readiness, the willingness, the eagerness of the people to kill Jews that was at least, if not more important, than Hitler's desire to kill them. On the other hand, without Hitler's summons, his bidding, neither program would necessarily have materialized. And in fact, there is evidence of the difficulty some Nazi officials experienced in whipping up sufficient anti-Jewish hatred among the populace. It is rare to find any of the Nazi perpetrators complaining that the German people were pressing authorities to speed up the expulsion and extermination of the Jews because it was going too slowly. Rather, there are complaints that the populace is insufficiently motivated for total and final solutions. To cite one study on this point, not at random but close to home, Goldhagen's own father, Erich Goldhagen, a refugee from wartime Europe, a Harvard Holocaust scholar and lecturer, published a 1972 essay called Pragmatism, Function, and Belief in Nazi Antisemitism, which portrayed the demand for anti-Jewish action coming from the top down, from the Nazi Party to the German people, rather than from the bottom up. Goldhagen père cites numerous instances of Goebbels and other propaganda officials of the Nazi Party feeling the need, in the midst of the war, to increase and intensify the anti-Semitic enlightenment of the populace. Noting that the Jewish question had been rather neglected in propaganda, one of Goebbels's ministry's inner circle warned that such neglect was false and dangerous. Dangerous because there was a fear of a fatal slackening in the level of Jew hatred, a level that needed constant bolstering. Goldhagen's father makes the same distinction as the son between the German populace's reaction to the euthanasia program and to the genocide of the Jews. But the father describes the German people's reaction to the knowledge of genocide in far milder terms than his son. He characterizes it as widespread indifference, approval, or only mild disapproval. Even the strongest term there, approval, is reactive, a sharp contrast with the proactive alacrity of the willing executioners the son describes. In the father's vision, anti-Semitic ideology conditioned ordinary Germans to not oppose the programmatic killing of Jews. They were a people who, they thought, deserved to perish. But the impulse to commence extermination did not issue from a public demand by ordinary Germans. Rather, it was accepted, indictment enough, when imposed from above. The father is closer to no Hitler, no Holocaust than the son. Who was the master? Who the servant? Who the mesmerist? Who the subject? Goldhagen the elder seems to see the bloodthirsty Hitler Party flogging the masses along to hate the Jews more than they do. Goldhagen the younger seems to see the evil eliminationist ideology permeating the hearts and minds of the German people, compelling Hitler and the party to carry out its collective genocidal wishes and dreams. Disentangling individual elements of what is a dynamic, a folie à deux between Hitler and the German people, is a tricky business, and it can be said that father and son are looking at two faces of a single process, a dynamic in which Hitler exacerbated the already implanted seeds of hatred, removed the restraints, while the responsive chord he struck in the German people liberated Hitler from any need to restrain himself in turning a murderous fantasy into reality. Similarly difficult to disentangle are the purely Christian and purely German strains of anti-Semitism. Chaim Maccabee wants to condemn the Christian and exempt the German cultural aspects of the genocide. Goldhagen seems to want to find something intrinsically German. Saul Friedlander has recently proposed a persuasive synthesis of the Christian, racist, and Wagnerian elements in Hitler's ideology, one he calls redemptive anti-Semitism. Instead of German national character, he speaks of the character of German nationality, the precarious and insecure sense of national selfhood that Germany, a nation that did not come into existence in anything like its current form until after 1848, felt. The newness, the precariousness, the easily threatened stability of German national identity, rather than its overweening strength, was what was crucial, Goldhagen argues. The precarious sense of self it afforded, the weakness of the new nation's internal bonds, fed an appetite for an ideology in which all Germans could define who they were by who they were not. An other, an inflammatory foreign body within, the Jews, a reaction to whose foreignness defined the body surrounding it. If Goldhagen doesn't believe in a German national character, he still seems to argue that there was a special German receptiveness to eliminationist anti-Semitism in the 19th century. If Germany was pregnant with murder by 1933, conception had taken place not when Hitler began speaking in Munich beer halls in the 1920s, but when the poison was injected into German culture late in the previous century. It is this aspect of his thesis that has come under the most persuasive attack. Yehuda Bauer had argued from first-hand acquaintance with the literature in several languages that Russian, French, Romanian, and Polish anti-Semitic literature was at least as virulent and violent as German. What's more, Russian, Polish, and Romanian anti-Semitic literature had little trouble in directly and repeatedly inciting actual outbreaks of murder by the populace, pogroms that killed tens of thousands of Jews in the period when Germans were reading and discussing anti-Semitic literature, at most legislating separationist measures. Perhaps the most cogent summation of the difficulties Holocaust scholars have with the Germanness of Goldhagen's thesis came from Professor Richard Brightman, Yehuda Bauer's successor as the editor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, then chairman of the History Department at Washington's American University, and the author of a highly nuanced study of the Hitler-Himmler relationship, The Architect of Genocide, which focuses on the timing and motivation of the ultimate decision to execute the final solution. I met with Brightman the day following the Holocaust Memorial Museum fracas over Goldhagen's thesis. Brightman suggested to me that what made German anti-Semitism turn to mass murder was not some special character it had in the 19th century, but rather the special character of 20th century German history. The defeat in the First World War, the subsequent starvation, humiliation, and inflation, followed, after an all-too-brief interval, by a crushing depression. These national traumas that devastated the German populace banked a kind of desperation and rage that Hitler was able to channel against Jews once he gained control of the apparatus of state power. Brightman emphasizes the devastation in the 1920s and the period of intense, murderous anti-Semitic propaganda Hitler saturated Germany with in the 1930s as more decisive in moving the population from attitude to action than something peculiarly German about its 19th century anti-Semitism. Goldhagen does not neglect 20th century factors, but he's devoted enormous effort in his book to documenting the pervasiveness and unique virulence of 19th century German anti-Semitism, of the pervasiveness of the eliminationist urge even among more liberal Germans who posed as friends of Jews, but who wanted them to assimilate themselves out of existence. It was over his emphasis on 19th century origins, I believe, that our conversation broke up, although other factors entered in. Germany really was different from other countries, particularly in the latter part of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th, he told me, when there was this vast outpouring of vituperative anti-Semitic literature, and even the growth of avowedly anti-Semitic political parties. There was something about that latter statement that I wanted to pursue, that remark about the growth of avowedly anti-Semitic political parties in the latter part of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. I asked Goldhagen about Professor Richard S. Levy's study, The Downfall of the Anti-Semitic Political Parties in Imperial Germany, a book which painted a picture of both those parties and the anti-Semitic political agitators behind them, suffering setbacks, failures, and virtually disappearing from German political life by 1912, which would seem to argue against a pre-war triumph of eliminationist anti-Semitism. "You're familiar with the Levy thesis, I'm sure," I began. "Yes," he said quickly. "But you see, there's a broader question there, which is, how do we read voting behavior?" He went into a long disquisition about voting behavior that attempted to demonstrate that the precipitous decline in voting for anti-Semitic political parties didn't necessarily mean a decline in anti-Semitic feeling. All of which might have been more convincing had he not just cited a rise in anti-Semitic political parties as a sure sign of a rise in such feeling. One can't have it both ways. If voting for anti-Semitic political parties means something, then a decline in voting means something, if not everything. But at that point a deeper problem made itself manifest. Whether it was my somewhat pointed question about the Levy thesis, a thesis that Goldhagen had omitted mentioning in his book, or whether this relatively mild query was the straw that broke the camel's back after the onslaughts from both the German press and the Jewish Holocaust scholars, suddenly it seemed it was all too much for Goldhagen to take. I had just asked him my next question. What were his views of the Bullock-Trevor-Roper dispute over Hitler's sincerity? Was Hitler a cynical manipulator of anti-Semitism, or a possessed true believer? When he suddenly interrupted his own answer in mid-sentence. "I need to interject something here," he told me. "I didn't realize it, but I have a reservation about this," meaning about speaking to me. "Actually, I have a contractual obligation to Knopf not to produce anything that will compete in some sense with my book for them." I assured him this book was a couple of years from appearing, much less competing. "No, I know," he said, "but I'm very legalistic in these matters, and I would actually like to talk to Knopf before going further with this." "You really think your contract prohibits you from talking to anyone writing a book?" "No, I would just like to talk to my editor there, let her know what I'm doing." "You know," I said, "I'm interviewing a lot of people who have written or are writing books. This is never— I know, I go by the letter of the law." "Have I said anything you objected to? Have my questions been belligerent?" "No, not at all," he said. "I want to think through some of these issues. I really would like to talk to her because it is actually part of the contract." "It says you can't do an interview with someone who's writing a book?" "It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that. It's just that Knopf has authorized this book and—" "But I went through the Knopf publicity department to arrange—" "I would like to talk to them about it." The way we left things, Goldhagen was going to call me if there was some contractual problem in talking to me. He didn't call, but I felt reluctant to pursue him for further reflections and risk further upsetting someone whose impassioned scholarship I had much respect for, particularly after Goldhagen told me a little more about what he'd been through in the weeks since the Holocaust Memorial Museum attacks and the German uproar. It had taken a toll on him, he said. the attacks, the heat of the spotlight. He was experiencing stress symptoms such as short-term memory lapses. There was one thing in particular that was upsetting him that day, he said. One specific aspect of the German uproar over his book that had shaken him. Something in the Der Spiegel story he regarded as an intrusive attempt to explain his explanation, to explain him, by dragging in his father. I had come across the Der Spiegel cover story, Ein Volk von Dämonen, the night before I met with Goldhagen, but had not had a chance to look at the sidebar interview with Eric Goldhagen, the one headlined, I'm Very Proud. I had come across the Der Spiegel cover story, Ein Volk von Dämonen, the night before I met with Goldhagen, but had not had a chance to look at the sidebar interview with Eric Goldhagen, the one headlined, I'm Very Proud. It was a strange piece, one in which the author, Enric Brodder, seemed to be attempting to mask his hostility toward both Goldhagens in the guise of an elaborate, condescending psychological explanation of the son's thesis as a sublimated expression of the father's wishes and fantasies, the father's love-hate affair with German culture. Brodder, a German Jew, begins by placing the Goldhagen father-son relationship in the context of the much-discussed, highly charged paradigm of the relationship between Holocaust survivors and their children. Eric Goldhagen was, in fact, a Holocaust survivor born in the Ukraine. He escaped to America from wartime Europe and rose eventually to a position as a lecturer in history at Harvard, where he developed a following for his powerful and moving lectures on Holocaust issues. He's also the author of a number of scholarly articles, some of which are cited in footnotes to his son's book. Certain of these articles mention in their author identification notes that Eric Goldhagen is working on a book on the ideology of genocide, a book that has yet to appear. The one aspect of the Holocaust Eric Goldhagen has not written about, has never spoken of in his lectures, is his own personal experience in surviving and escaping it. His son has said his father has never discussed the experience with him, and neither has wished to discuss the influence of the father's survivor experience on the son's thesis about Germany. Onto this virtual vacuum of actual information, Brodder projects his own grand theory, that the son's book is a sublimation of the father's unexpressed longings, the working out of a curious personal agenda vis-à-vis German culture. Claiming to base his generalizations about Holocaust survivors and their children on psychological literature, Brodder argues that survivor parents demand a price from their offspring, demand a kind of reparational devotion to their parents' suffering. He proceeds to speculate, apparently without much first-hand information, one can see why this upset Daniel Goldhagen, about the son's childhood. He envisions the father inculcating the son with the historic magnitude of the Holocaust experience, cramming his mind with details, so that as a child Daniel knew more about Adolf Eichmann and Heinrich Himmler than Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. There is a barely restrained suggestion of subtextual mockery in this line of Brodder's that I found disturbing. Brodder goes on to say that Daniel's father instilled in him a mission to revolutionize Holocaust scholarship, a mission the father began too late to accomplish himself. Brodder has a unique notion of what this mission was. It was not strictly a mission of revenge, he asserts, not German bashing, not an attack on German culture, but an attempt to become part of it. After Brodder quotes Eric Goldhagen expounding at length to him on the best-selling success of his son's book, after quoting him attacking those who attacked his son at the Holocaust Memorial Museum, Yehuda Bauer was only jealous of Daniel's success. Brodder quotes Goldhagen's father speaking fondly of German culture. The Jews were the German culture bearers in Eastern Europe. For me, facility with the German language came as naturally as the use of French for Russian aristocrats. My mother knew Goethe and Schiller by heart. Broder then records that, over the transatlantic phone line, Goldhagen the elder recited to him the first lines of Schiller's Die Glocke in fluent German. All of which leads Broder to theorize, to explain the Goldhagen father and son mission as ultimately not the product of hostility to German culture, but rather of a thwarted love. An effort to get back in contact with the culture after 50 years' absence, a culture from which the German culture bearer had been expelled. This contact can only be accomplished via the story of the Holocaust, the endpoint of German Jewish history, which has now become the starting point of joined scholarly activity, the only thing that binds Germans and Jews existentially. This is a remarkably self-satisfied German vision of Goldhagen's thesis and of the Jewish relationship to German culture. This view of the Jews with their noses still pressed to the glass of the great German culture, using the Holocaust, their own tragedy, as a kind of ticket back to the mothership. But the urge to explain Daniel Goldhagen's thesis as somehow an expression of his father is not confined to Germans. I heard it the night after I spoke to Goldhagen from an American Jewish scholar, Richard S. Levy, distinguished professor of history at the University of Illinois and moderator of an Internet scholars group discussion of Holocaust issues that had taken up, mostly critically, the Goldhagen thesis. Levy was, of course, also the author of The Downfall of the Anti-Semitic Political Parties in Imperial Germany, a study which at the very least casts doubt on Goldhagen's thesis that anti-Semitism had been irrevocably implanted in the German psyche by the end of the 19th century. Levy told me that he thought Goldhagen's book could be seen as the father using the son as vindication in the father's struggle with the Holocaust scholar establishment for recognition of his views. Vindication for the big book on the ideology of genocide the father himself had not produced, and that, as a survivor, he was using his son to punish the German perpetrators, a kind of revenge for the mass murder he barely escaped from. One can understand how theories that depict him as a pawn of his father would upset Goldhagen, but the episode left me puzzled, wondering if, in fact, there might be something to the notion of explanation as revenge. It happened that shortly after I spoke to Goldhagen, there arrived in the mail from Professor Beryl Lang a copy of an essay he had written on Holocaust Memory and Revenge for the quarterly Jewish Social Studies. It was an absolutely unique and fascinating exploration of a controversial and difficult theme, another example of the reason I find Lang's work so valuable. His style is cautious, not flashy, his rhetoric scholarly, not sensational, but he is willing to take on and investigate some stark, radical, even sensational questions about how to envision and respond to evil. Here he undertakes an extremely careful and considered examination of a radical question. How could it be that revenge was not an element in the Jewish reaction to the Shoah? In fact, he says, there have been some isolated examples of direct vengeance, outbreaks of retaliation against German prisoners of war by Jews in charge of their camps. Then there was the ambitious plan by former Jewish partisans to poison the water supplies of German cities to punish collectively the German people for complicity in genocide, a plan that actually got as far as poisoning German prisoners' food in one detention camp. And there were and are Nazi hunters such as Simon Wiesenthal and the Klarsfelds, but Lang considers this more in the realm of justice and law rather than vengeance. He's more interested in what he calls displaced, indirect forms of revenge on Germans. There was wartime U.S. Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau's ambitious plan to reduce post-war Germany to an agrarian economy to prevent a resurgence of the fevers that had twice brought the world total war in this century. There are the spontaneous, ad hoc individual boycotts of contemporary German products, such as Volkswagen and Mercedes cars, of German cultural figures, such as Wagner, whose works some Israeli orchestras refuse to play. Lang even sees Emil Fackenheim's famous commandment enjoining Jews never to give Hitler any posthumous victories, which requires a vigilant monitoring of actions vis-à-vis contemporary Germans and Germany, as a kind of devotional, displaced revenge. Most surprising about Lang's analysis, as I read it, is that he does not take the conventional route and disparage revenge outright. Rather, in his unique fashion, he scrupulously examines the unusual allegiance between revenge and memory. He even goes so far as to say that revenge is useful for memory and identity. Emphasis added. He contrasts two kinds of memory: the commemoration of the Holocaust in memorials and museums, which tends to comfort the survivors and establish their memory in the minds of those who came after, and revenge, which reinforces the memory of the crime among the heirs and successors of the perpetrators and solidifies the identity of those enacting the revenge. Lang argues that, in effect, revenge is better if it comes out of the closet, so to speak, rather than disguise itself through displacements and sublimations, in which it might lose its impact and clarity for both the perpetrator of the crime and the perpetrator of revenge. But in his most cautious rhetoric, Lang asks us not to dismiss the notion of revenge as beyond the pale of legitimacy. Can Goldhagen's thesis about the Germanness of the Holocaust be seen as a kind of displaced revenge in Beryl Lang's sense of the term? As an intellectual rationale of a vengeful impulse not quite conscious of itself? If it wasn't intended vengefully, it came across that way, even to some of its most sophisticated readers, who believed Goldhagen was branding the German mind, character, and soul as irretrievably iniquitous. Are all these readers, as Goldhagen insists, reading into his thesis something that isn't there? Or are they reading in it something of which Goldhagen might not be completely aware? I know that when I first saw the headline in Der Spiegel about the Goldhagen controversy, Ein Volk von Dämonen, I had two conflicting reactions. At first, I felt somewhat disturbed by the apparent attempt to accuse Goldhagen, a Jew, of using the same kind of demonizing rhetoric about Germans that Germans use to demonize Jews. But I must admit that there was another dimension to my reaction to it, a certain satisfaction in thinking about ordinary Germans confronting that sensational headline on their newsstand, a headline whose primal accusatory power, a people of the devil, would, for many, transcend the irony intended. So much of recent German discussion of the Holocaust has been about how, not so much whether, one can normalize German history, how to see the Hitler years in the context of deeper, longer trends in Western history, how to contextualize the horrors in relative terms, compared, for instance, to the Asiatic horrors of Stalin. But here was a reminder that however much ordinary Germans might feel they've normalized, absolved themselves, explained themselves to others, to many they still need to prove they're not a people of the devil. And so I suppose it could be said that part of the satisfaction I felt from that headline did arise from a vengeful or at least punitive impulse, what Beryl Lang calls displaced revenge. A wish to impress upon ordinary Germans that even if they objected to the notion of a demonic national character, they shouldn't be exempt from a continuing examination of demonic national behavior. That the responsibility for explaining Hitler was at least as much theirs as ours, and if they couldn't explain Hitler, they ought not to attempt to explain him away. Consequently, I found I couldn't fault Goldhagen for his accusatory passion, though I also understood the irritation of some Jewish Holocaust scholars with him. They, the older generation of scholars, people like Yehuda Bauer, many far closer to the tragedy than Goldhagen, had gone to great lengths and perhaps great sacrifice to purge from their work any personal rage and vengefulness in their attempts to explain the Hitler regime's crimes and the German people's behavior. They'd held themselves to the self-effacing pursuit of the ideal of scholarly neutrality, a supposedly higher ideal. And then along comes a novice academic who restates what to them are obvious and well-known facts, but casts them in the accusatory, emotionally charged tones of a new, vengeful indictment. And he's acclaimed as a knight of Jewish truth-telling. His book achieves the worldwide bestsellerdom few scholarly books attain, and he's hailed for his courage in daring to say what they, have not. Still, Goldhagen's passion, whether you say it's for justice, revenge, or enlightenment, was something I respected. Clearly he felt it, and to deny it in his prose would have been less than honest, which made it all the more disappointing when I learned of the changes made in the German translation of his book. A second cover story in Der Spiegel, some 3 months after the first, tied to the release of the German edition of Goldhagen's book and his German publicity tour, a friendlier story this time, included another curious sidebar. This one described certain crucial changes in the German translation of Goldhagen's book, dramatic softenings of key phrases, beginning with the very title. Instead of Hitler's willing executioners, usually Scharfrichter, in the German translation it is closer to Hitler's willing executors, Vollstrecker, as in the custodians of a legacy, a will. Executors is certainly a less inflammatory, less bloody vision of the role of ordinary Germans than executioners. It's a different notion of will they're carrying out. Executors makes them sound like neutral functionaries. An executor is closer to Arendt's banal bureaucrats following orders than to Goldhagen's depiction of the perpetrators as bloodthirsty enthusiasts for torture and murder. Consider some other changes among the many spotlighted by Der Spiegel. The German conception of the Jews in the 20th century, in the English original, has become the typical 20th century conception. The expulsion of the 500,000 Jews from Germany, the entire Jewish population, is, in the English edition, the most radical act in centuries of Western European history. In the German edition, it's the most radical act in decades of Western European history, which says something entirely different. In addition, the English version tells us the entire German elite wholeheartedly accepted eliminationist anti-Semitic measures. In the German version, the German elites were merely obliging in their acceptance. Of the accounts I've seen of the subsequent popularity of Goldhagen's book, and Goldhagen himself, among ordinary Germans, only Fritz Stern in Foreign Affairs has suggested these fairly dramatic softenings of his rhetoric may have played as much of a role as Goldhagen's widely noted personal charm with German audiences. Was Goldhagen having second thoughts about the displaced revenge in his book? Was it vengeful in the first place? I called Beryl Lang to ask him if he thought Goldhagen's thesis could be considered a kind of displaced revenge. Yes, he said simply. He'd just reviewed the book for the Jewish publication Moment. He felt the exaggerated nature of its claim to have discovered the necessary and sufficient cause for explaining the Holocaust and Hitler in the ideology of eliminationist anti-Semitism is so excessive nobody can claim necessary and sufficient cause for the simplest act in history, much less one so complex, that it suggests that something more is at work than objective historical analysis, something that fits Lang's description of a displaced, unacknowledged revenge impulse. Lang finds further support for his belief in what he calls Goldhagen's extremely inconsistent account of just how many perpetrators, how many executioners, there were among the German people. He says there are 100,000 who participated in the killing process, and sometimes 500,000, but he also seems to argue that the rest of the 60 million German people were as much active participants as the 100,000. He ignores the opposition, and if it, genocide, was the overriding goal always, why did it not happen before it did? Why, as late as 1941, was the policy still enforced expulsion, but not extermination? Curiously, just a day after I spoke to Lang, revenge returned with a vengeance as a Holocaust issue. The front page of the lively Jewish weekly The Forward featured a story about Elie Wiesel and the impulse toward revenge, a story headlined, "The Rage That Elie Wiesel Edited Out of Night." In it, Naomi Seidman, a young Jewish scholar at the Berkeley Theological Seminary, was quoted on her comparative study of the original Yiddish manuscript of Night, Wiesel's first impassioned book about his concentration camp experiences, and the French translation published in 1956, the one that led to his worldwide acclaim, the one from which all English versions are derived. Seidman argued that in the Yiddish version, the young Wiesel focused his rage specifically against Germans and Germany, that he railed against a world that was rehabilitating Germany, where the bestial sadist Ilse Koch, the beast of Buchenwald, is happily raising her children. In the Yiddish version, Wiesel spoke of his disappointment after the war that camp survivors did not take vengeance on their captors and the captor nations. The historical commandment to revenge was not fulfilled, Wiesel wrote. But, she says, Wiesel excised these references to revenge against Germans in the French version of his book, under the tutelage of the French existentialist writer François Mauriac, his patron, who brought his manuscript to the attention of the world, got him a French publisher, and wrote glowing introductions to the French and English editions. Seidman suggests further that in revising his Yiddish manuscript for translation, Wiesel redirected his rage from Germans to an existential quarrel with God, a rage against the bleak meaninglessness of the universe. She claims Wiesel did so in order to make his memoir less offensive to Christian Europe, to existential European intellectuals. She argues his revisions of the Yiddish manuscript recast the Holocaust in the post-Christian rhetoric of death of God theology, that Wiesel made the tragedy as much about the death of God, or belief, as the death of Jews at the hands of Germans. Seidman seems to imply a kind of bad faith on Wiesel's part, as an explanation for the excision of thoughts about anti-German revenge, that he was attempting to make his persona more palatable to the Christian West, to curry favor. Not so, the scholars Eli Pfefferkorn and David Hirsch contend. The quarrel with God is clearly established in the Yiddish book, and Wiesel himself denied to the Forward there had been any conscious agenda behind his revisions. He claimed he was merely trying to shorten his manuscript for the French edition. This does not completely rule out a third explanation for the revisions that neither Wiesel nor Seidman advanced, that Wiesel might have had genuine second thoughts about the revenge impulse that leaped out of his pen when he first set down his feelings in memoir form, that his thinking might genuinely have changed between the Yiddish version and the French revision. Perhaps the same thing could be said about Goldhagen's shift from the English to the German version of his thesis, from calling ordinary Germans executioners to calling them executors and the like, from blaming something specifically German to blaming history, the more abstract 20th century rather than 20th century Germans, for the tragedy. In any case, both Lang's reflections on revenge and the controversies over Goldhagen's and Wiesel's revisions prompted me to look a little more closely at the possible presence of a displaced revenge impulse in my own work, in the character of my preoccupation with Hitler and Hitler explanations. I looked at the nature of my own dissatisfaction with Goldhagen's thesis in that light. It was a dissatisfaction not so much with the extremity with which it pilloried Germans, as with the way in which it, implicitly at least, could serve to exculpate Hitler. If the German people were so relentlessly and inexorably driven by their eliminationist anti-Semitic ideology, then they had no choice but to act the way they did. And having no choice, they have no responsibility, any more than a schizophrenic who hears delusory voices in his head urging him to kill, voices he has no power to resist, has responsibility. By insisting on the overwhelming, irresistible power of his central model, the abstract force he calls eliminationist anti-Semitism, Goldhagen performs an eliminationist act himself. He eliminates from consideration, from history, those individuals and groups who did resist: the Munich Post journalists who attempted to expose Hitler, the Social Democratic Party activists whose failure does not diminish the importance of their struggle, the Germans who voted against Hitler, as the majority of Germans in every free election did. In a very real sense, Goldhagen's fixation on the all-powerful determinism of his central model has the inadvertent effect of exculpating even the guilty among the German people, making them seem helpless pawns of that inexorable force, powerless to resist, powerless to choose otherwise. Perhaps this helps explain, perhaps this is the real reason for, the extraordinary popularity of his book, the German version anyway, with the German public. Perhaps there was, then, displaced revenge at work in my reaction to Goldhagen's thesis about the German people. I did not wish to absolve them by shifting responsibility from individuals to a central model, by blaming an abstract German character rather than the individual German characters who chose to act as they did. And I suppose my dissatisfaction with some of Goldhagen's critics could be said to have sprung from the same source: displaced revenge. It might explain my reaction to Christopher Browning's critical explanation of Goldhagen's explanation. Browning is Goldhagen's arch-rival among the younger generation of Holocaust scholars. Goldhagen denounced Browning's 1992 book, Ordinary Men, about a killing squad of German policemen, in a scathing New Republic review, in which he accused Browning of being duped by the apologetic post-war testimony of those accused mass murderers, duped into believing that they had trouble making the transition from ordinary men to killers. The very subtitle of Goldhagen's book, Ordinary Germans and the Holocaust, is a deliberate shot at Browning's Ordinary Men title. It was the Germanness of these killers, not their ordinariness, that was most decisive, Goldhagen insisted. I visited Browning a couple of days after the wild Holocaust memorial pillorying of Goldhagen. Browning had been a speaker there too that evening, but he avoided personal attack, delivering his critique in a respectful, serious manner. However deep his disagreements, however much he'd felt injured by Goldhagen's previous attacks on him, he did not question Goldhagen's motives or good faith. In his office in the Holocaust Memorial Research Division, Browning, a scruffily youthful-looking scholar whose bowl-cut hair evokes both beetle and monkish associations, filled me in, before we got to the Goldhagen question, on the current line of research he's pursuing. He's one of the international group of scholars who've been focusing on the decision question, the controversy over just when, and why then, Hitler made the irrevocable decision to proceed with the final solution. It's a fascinating dispute, to which I'll devote much of the next chapter, because theories about exactly when Hitler made the decision involve more than just quibbles about days and months. Almost inevitably, they turn out to be theories about the nature of Hitler's mind, about the place of Jew hatred in his heart, the sincerity or opportunism of his anti-Semitism, in a way a recapitulation of the Bullock-Trevor-Roper debate, about the map of his psyche, about who Hitler really was. Almost always, a scholar's position on when Hitler made the decision is a reflection of his position on these larger questions. In general, the earlier a scholar or historian locates what he or she believes was Hitler's irrevocable decision to physically exterminate the Jews, the more they see a Hitler whose obsession with Jews eclipses anything else in his consciousness. The later a scholar locates the decision, the more he or she sees a Hitler with other, sometimes conflicting concerns: Lebensraum, his war aims, the practical realities of troop and train deployments, a somewhat more pragmatic, conflicted, or indecisive Hitler. Thus, the late, much-respected historian Lucy Davidovich argued that Hitler had decided to devote his life to the extermination of the Jews as early as 1918. She cites a letter Hitler wrote in 1919 to a doctor in Munich declaring that the Jews must be eliminated to save Germany, not as some abstract prescription, but as a literal goal. A goal that everything Hitler did after that, including launch a world war, was devoted to fulfilling. Which is why Davidovich titled her book on Hitler The War Against the Jews. World War II, she insists, was not a war against Poland, France, England, and Russia, so much as it was a war against the Jews, waged to give Hitler the power to execute the decision he'd made 2 decades earlier. Goldhagen emphasizes the moment just a bit later than Davidovich. A speech Hitler delivered in 1920, the difference between them being that, in Goldhagen's thesis, Hitler's decision, his will, plays a far less important role than the already determined, already gestating murder that 19th century hate literature had impregnated Germans with. Between the Davidovich-Goldhagen 1918 to 1920 pole and the extreme functionalist position, which argues that Hitler never really made the key extermination decision itself, he passively acceded to something which gathered momentum from the exigencies of harried bureaucrats who had more captive Jews on their hands than they knew what to do with. There are a number of distinct gradations of decision theory, on the spectrum from moderate intentionalist to moderate functionalist, as the converging positions of contemporary scholars have been called. There are those intentionalists who believe Hitler had the wish and the fantasy to exterminate the Jews foremost in his mind before 1939, and was waiting only till the outbreak of the war to make the fantasy reality. There are those who point out that even after the events of 1939 put millions of Polish Jews under Hitler's control, planning still continued in a desultory way to evacuate Jews to Madagascar or to relocate them in southern Poland. They argue that it wasn't until 1941, when Hitler conceived and executed the invasion of Russia, that he made up his mind about what to do with the Jews. But even within 1941, current scholarship is embroiled in debates over which month, which week, which weekend the decision was made, and why it was made then. Yehuda Bauer argues for March 1941. The moderate intentionalists, led by Richard Breitman, place the decision in May 1941, shortly before the Russian invasion, which makes the capture of the millions of Jews in Soviet territory an exterminationist objective of the surprise attack on Russia. Other intentionalists place the decision somewhat later, in the early euphoric days of the Russian campaign, in late June or July 1941, when, they assert, Hitler, intoxicated by victory, finally allowed his long-deferred wish-dream of extermination to emerge. And to be funded, he finally allocated the troops and trains necessary to make mass murder a massive industry. The moderate functionalists tend to place the decision 2 or 3 months later, when the first euphoria of the Russian campaign bogged down, when Hitler had his first apprehension that victory in the East wouldn't be as swift, as complete, and as certain as it first seemed, and the administrators of the captured territories pressed for a way to dispose of captive Jews. In this view, the decision for genocide was Hitler's revenge or consolation prize for a lost victory. This had been Browning's position, although when I spoke to him he seemed to be shifting in the light of a new study by German scholar Peter Witte that seemed to narrow the moment of decision down not to a month, but to a single weekend in mid-September 1941, the weekend of September 16th to 17th, 1941. Witte argues that until September 1941, 3 months into the Russian campaign, Hitler had placed a higher priority on the anti-Soviet rather than the anti-Jewish aspects of the war on the Eastern Front. For a period of 6 months in the spring and summer of 1941, Hitler's guidelines remained in effect, i.e., that no Jews were to be deported from the Reich and the Polish Protectorate before there was a successful conclusion to the Russian campaign. Hitler personally stressed this point on a number of occasions. While this may have been a tactical decision, dictated by military considerations, Witte seems to argue that Hitler had not yet decided whether to transform the sporadic special action killing of Jews into a comprehensive program of extermination. Hitler's decision to deport the Jews from the territory of Greater Germany while the fighting was still taking place, the decision to commence full-scale extermination, occurred quite suddenly in the middle of September 1941. Witte argues. He cites certain decisions Hitler made on that weekend, decisions to approve allocation of trains and troops to evacuate Jews from Germany and France to the east, as the orders that broke the log-jam of indecision and began the uninterrupted flow of evacuees to the death factories. Interestingly, Witte's analysis places the decision after the initial euphoria of the Russian campaign and after the first disappointment that followed. He locates it in a brief moment after the disappointment, a blip in time in which the news on the Eastern Front turned temporarily good again, which makes the decision a product of both bitterness and triumph. A recent claim by a German historian, Christian Gerlach, that the order came not until December 18, 1941, appears to be a misinterpretation of notes Himmler made about how Hitler wanted him to spin the leaks about the killing process already underway. The Jews were being killed because of their activities as guerrilla partisans. I'll go deeper into the decision question in the next chapter, but here I'm concerned with a different aspect of Browning's thinking, with his explanation of the remarkable mainstream popularity of Goldhagen's thesis. In particular, his explanation of the disparity between its almost universal acclaim in the mainstream media and its more frequent disparagement among fellow scholars. Browning's explanation, an unusual venture into media cultural analysis for a scholar, focuses on what he believes is a popular reaction against some recent deeper trends in scholarship about Hitler and the Holocaust. Browning sees an impulse in the scholarly literature to look for ever broader, allegedly deeper explanations for Hitler's crimes, deeper than Jew hatred, deeper than Nazism, deeper than Germanism. To look for the kind of explanation that sees all of these as mere products of some more profound and universal flawed disposition in Western civilization. To see Nazism, Hitlerism, not as an aberration of Western civilization, but as a culmination of certain of its tendencies, usually racism, eugenicism, or a racial biological-based supremacist aesthetic. Or, as the now fashionable academic buzzword has it, biopolitics. Biopolitics is a vision of the World War II-era killing that includes and explains the killings of gypsies, homosexuals, and Slavs, the euthanasia of the physical and mental defectives and other inferior types, in the same inclusive racial eugenicist drive that targeted Jews. It's an explanatory vision that sees not Jewishness but a generalized otherness as the target, thus denying Jewishness its special relevance. In addition, instead of seeing Hitler as some monstrous enemy of civilized Western values, Hitler becomes a kind of perverse embodiment of the worst impulses buried in, intrinsic to, Western culture, to the Western project, as the postmodernists like to call it. The kind of explanation that sees Nazism as merely an extreme variation of Western racism might be called the politically correct view of the origins of the Holocaust, although Browning, who buys into some of its assumptions, wouldn't disparage it that way. It tends to broaden, to obscure the identity of the primary perpetrators and the primary victims of the Holocaust, Browning believes. Broadens it beyond German and Jew, tends to make the specific identity of the victims less relevant. The mainstream popularity of the Goldhagen book, with its thesis about eliminationist anti-Semitism, the all-powerful, all-explaining central model, is, Browning argues, a reaction against this scholarly tendency, a reaction that returns the focus once again to the primal duality of German and Jew. People have lost their Holocaust, Browning told me, in the supposedly sophisticated, broadening explanation of contemporary scholars. What Goldhagen is doing, he says, using a somewhat patronizing, if not deliberately offensive metaphor, is re-ghettoizing it for them, narrowing it to a story about Jews and the Germans rather than about the West and the generalized other. I suspect that Browning is overestimating the degree to which trends in contemporary scholarship have penetrated or even registered in mainstream popular consciousness enough to provoke a counter-reaction. Still, if it's true, as he says, that Goldhagen's thesis represents a kind of narrowing, my problem with it, and here is where displaced revenge might make itself manifest, is that Goldhagen does not narrow things enough. The eliminationist aspect of his thesis that troubles me most is its virtual elimination of Hitler from it. By portraying the German people as pregnant with inevitable, inexorable murder, by reducing Hitler to a marginal midwife role, Goldhagen's thesis does what Browning's more sophisticated explainers seem to be doing, attributing the crime to an irresistible abstraction that overwhelmed ordinary Germans. In effect, he makes the perpetrators themselves a kind of victim, victims of ideological poisoning which robbed them of the power to resist, robbed them of agency, of choice, any possibility of pursuing another, any other, course than the one they'd been driven to. They weren't following the orders of a Hitler, but like Hitler, they were driven by the orders of an abstract impersonal idea that deprived them, deprived even Hitler, of responsibility, and thus of culpability. Goldhagen's insistence on the inevitability of the Holocaust, if not Hitler, someone like him, on the irresistibility of the impersonal force that compelled ordinary Germans to do its bidding and made the genocide unavoidable, is challenged further by an illuminating recent book about the circumstances of Hitler's takeover. Hitler's 30 Days to Power, by Yale's Henry Ashby Turner, is a close examination of the political maneuvering in January 1933, the month that ended with Hitler being called to the chancellorship by Hindenburg. Turner follows Bullock's footsteps in examining in telling detail just how precarious, contingent that end result was, the extent to which Hindenburg's fateful decision to call upon Hitler was the product of unpredictable factors of chance and personality, rumor and accident, rather than the inevitable product of historical abstractions. Turner focuses in particular on the rivalry between General Kurt von Schleicher, the manipulative chancellor in power before Hitler, and the even more manipulative ex-chancellor Franz von Papen, who maneuvered Hitler into power in the mistaken belief that he, Papen, would be the one pulling the strings. Perhaps the single worst miscalculation in every respect in 20th century history. Turner's account emphasizes just how much Hitler's January 1933 nomination as Chancellor was, as Yehuda Bauer put it, due more to his electoral failure 2 months earlier in November 1932, to his perceived slippage, to the very real sense that the forces of history were leaving him behind. Such a perception made him seem less threatening, more manageable to those like Papen, who schemed to get him into the job as their cat's paw. Hitler's triumph, Turner argues persuasively, was far from inevitably determined by historical forces and central models and the like. To explain Hitler's acquisition of power in deterministic terms is to rule out the question of responsibility for that disastrous development, Turner writes. If his appointment as Chancellor was the inexorable result of impersonal forces beyond the control of the individuals involved, then it would obviously be unjust to hold any of them responsible. Emphasis added. Indeed, it could be said that if that was true, it diminishes Hitler's responsibility. He becomes a cat's paw of historical inevitability.